May 12, 1943. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood on a rugged Tunisian ridge, his binoculars fixed on the horizon where the azure of the Mediterranean met the scorched earth of Cape Bon. For years, the sands of North Africa had been the playground of legends, the stage where the desert fox, Erwin Rommel, had forged a reputation of invincibility. But today, the air didn't smell of salt or diesel. It smelled of finality. Behind von Arnim, the remnants of the once proud Afrika Korps were a ghost of their former selves. Men who had marched halfway to the Nile were now burning their code books, smashing their radio sets, and draining the last of their water skins. In Berlin, the mood was a world away from the searing heat, yet the atmospheric pressure was just as crushing. Inside the Wolfsschanze, the Wolf's Lair, the German High Command, OKW, was beginning to realize that the sideshow in Africa had become a hemorrhaging wound that could no longer be stitched. While the propaganda machines of Joseph Goebbels still churned out tales of heroic resistance, the maps in the war room told a different story. The red arrows of the Allied Operation Torch and the relentless push of Montgomery's Eighth Army had finally met, forming a steel vise that was crushing the Axis presence into a tiny terminal pocket. The stakes were no longer about capturing the Suez Canal or seizing Middle Eastern oil. The collapse of the Tunisian bridge had meant something far more terrifying for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The fortress Europe was about to lose its moat. With Africa gone, the soft underbelly of the continent lay exposed. As von Arnim prepared to send his final radio transmission, the tension in Hitler's headquarters reached a fever pitch. The disaster wasn't just tactical. It was a psychological earthquake that threatened to shatter the myth of German supremacy. The end wasn't coming in weeks or days. It was coming in hours. May 13, 1943. The ticking of the clock in the conference room at the Wolfsschanze felt like a hammer blow against the silence. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel and General Oberst Alfred Jodl stared at the latest teleprinter reports with a mixture of dread and practiced stoicism. The final message from Tunisia had arrived. All ammunition spent, arms and equipment destroyed. The German Afrika Korps has fought, according to orders, to the last man. The DAK must rise again. For the High Command, these words weren't just a military report. They were a funeral oration. Over 230,000 German and Italian soldiers, men who were desperately needed to hold the crumbling Eastern Front, were now walking into Allied prisoner of war camps. This was a Stalingrad in the sun, a disaster of such magnitude that the OKW struggled to find a way to frame it to the Führer. Hitler, meanwhile, was paralyzed by a rare, brooding quiet. He had refused Rommel's earlier pleas to evacuate the veterans while there was still time, obsessed with the idea that every inch of soil must be held at any cost. Now, that stubbornness had cost him an entire army group. Behind closed doors, the lake of fire rhetoric was replaced by cold, hard panic. The Mediterranean was no longer an Axis lake. It was a highway for Allied shipping. The High Command knew that the collapse of North Africa meant the inevitable loss of Italy as an effective ally. Mussolini's regime was already teetering, and the German generals began to whisper about the underbelly of the continent. If the British and Americans could land in Tunisia, they could land in Sicily, Sardinia, or the Balkans. The logistical reality was even grimmer. The loss of North Africa didn't just mean losing territory. It meant losing the initiative. The Luftwaffe had been bled white trying to supply the bridgehead, and the Italian Navy was effectively paralyzed. As the staff officers cleared the maps of the African theater, they weren't just closing a chapter of the war. They were realizing that for the first time since 1939, the Third Reich was no longer the hunter. It was the prey. May 19, 1943. A week after surrender, the corridors of the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, were thick with a tension that surpassed even the darkest days of the Russian winter. Hitler paced the floor, his frustration boiling over into erratic outbursts. To the High Command, he blamed the Italians for their cowardice and his own generals for a lack of will. But beneath the outburst lay a calculated, cold-blooded fear shared by Jodl and the OKW staff. The Allies were no longer thousands of miles away across an ocean. They were standing on the doorstep. The intelligence reports landing on the desks of the Abwehr military intelligence were a chaotic storm of misinformation. The British had launched a masterful deception campaign, most famously Operation Mincemeat, planting false document on a corpse to suggest the next Allied blow would fall on Greece or Sardinia. The German High Command was paralyzed by the Mediterranean dilemma. They had to guess where the hammer would fall next. But after the total collapse in Tunisia, they no longer had the luxury of being wrong. Every division moved to the Balkans was a division taken away from the defense of Sicily. Every tank sent to Italy was one less for the upcoming offensive at Kursk. The human cost of the North African collapse began to ripple through the German homeland. Unlike the secret, snowy disappearance of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the loss of the Afrika Korps was impossible to hide. These were the Afrikaner, the elite sun-bronze heroes of German newsreels. Their letters home had abruptly stopped. In the officer clubs of Berlin, the mood shifted from bravado to a grim, whispered realism. They spoke of the Tunisgrad, a dark play on words that linked the desert defeat to the Russian disaster. The High Command realized that the Allies had achieved something more dangerous than territory. They had achieved perfect synchronization. The Americans had the industrial might, and the British had the tactical experience. For the first time, the OKW was forced to draft offensive plans for the home front. The Mediterranean, once a theater of colonial conquest, had now become the front line of a defensive struggle for the very survival of the Reich. The wake of the North African collapse, the strategic rift between Berlin and Rome turned into a chasm. At the High Command headquarters, the German generals began to view their Italian counterparts not as partners, but as liabilities. Reports from the Abwehr indicated that the Italian spirit had been broken in the desert. The loss of their foreshore in Libya and Tunisia had stripped the fascist regime of its last shred of legitimacy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now sidelined and recovering in Germany, warned Hitler directly the defense of the Mediterranean could no longer rely on Italian troops. This lack of trust led to a frantic, clandestine reshuffling of the Wehrmacht. The OKW began Operation Ulrich, a secret plan to occupy Italy should Mussolini's government collapse. It was a surreal moment in the war. German planners were drafting invasion maps for the territory of their own primary ally. The collapse in Africa had forced Hitler to divert elite divisions, including the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, from the Eastern Front, a move that would prove fatal as the titanic Battle of Kursk loomed. The psychological blow to the High Command was compounded by the sudden vulnerability of the oil route. With the Allies controlling the North African coastline, the Mediterranean was now a gauntlet of death for German U-boats and transport ships. The OKW knew that the British and Americans were massing an armada of unprecedented size in the ports of Oran, Algiers, and Tunis. Inside the war rooms, the debate raged. Where would the blow land? Jodl argued for the Balkans, fearing a loss of Romanian oil. Hitler, swayed by the mincemeat deception, became obsessed with Greece. Only a few, including Kesselring, looked at the map and saw the obvious stepping stone, Sicily. The collapse of Africa hadn't just removed a front. It had turned the entire southern border of the Nazi Empire into a 2,000-mile-long emergency. The fortress was now under siege from a direction they had never truly prepared to defend. July 10, 1943. The pre-dawn silence at the OKW headquarters was shattered by a single, frantic word. Husky. The Allies had struck, not in Greece or Sardinia, but in Sicily. As the first reports of the massive amphibious landings reached Berlin, the collapse of North Africa was no longer a past defeat. It was a catalyst for a total strategic nightmare. The soft underbelly of Europe had been pierced, and the German High Command found themselves in a frantic race against time. The men they had lost in Tunisia, the veteran panzer crews and the battle-hardened paratroopers, were the very ghosts they now needed to man the coastal defenses. For the High Command, the realization was catastrophic. By refusing to retreat from Africa months earlier, they had traded their best troops for a temporary delay. Now, they were forced to fight a war on three fronts: the grinding attrition of the East, the impending invasion of the West, and the bleeding wound of the South. The desert sands had swallowed the Reich's initiative, leaving only a desperate, defensive crouch. General Alfred Jodl would later admit that the loss of North Africa and the subsequent invasion of Sicily represented the turning of the tide, the moment when the Mediterranean became the graveyard of Axis ambitions. The final irony was found in the memoirs of the men who sat in those bunkers. They spoke of the North African campaign with a haunting nostalgia, calling it a war without hate. But as the maps were redrawn and the Allied bombers began using North African airfields to strike deep into the heart of Germany, the sentimentality evaporated. The collapse had proven that the German war machine, for all its tactical brilliance, could not win a war of global logistics and industrial endurance. As the sun rose over a now contested Europe, the High Command looked toward the horizon with a new, chilling clarity. The collapse in the desert had been the beginning of the end. The Mediterranean was lost. Italy was crumbling. And for the first time, the leaders of the Wehrmacht truly understood that the road started in Tripoli and El Alamein would lead, inevitably, to the ruins of Berlin.